You know how data is like the new oil these days? Well, get this. Today, we're diving deep into how to protect that data, especially over in Spain. We found this website from a Spanish law firm. It's called MCHMAbogados. They're all about data protection, and they break down this thing called the Data Protection Officer, a DPO.
Right.
So our mission today is to figure out exactly when a company in Spain, by law, has to have one of these DPOs. And, even if your business isn't in Spain, this is still important stuff because this whole data privacy thing, it's global.
Yeah, it really is. And what's interesting to me here is how Spain goes above and beyond what the EU already does. It's not just about following the GDPR. There are all these Spain-specific rules on top of that. Gives you a sense of how different countries are approaching this whole data protection thing in their own way, which I think we're going to see more of around the world.
Yeah, definitely not one-size-fits-all situation. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's break down this DPO thing. The website explains it pretty well. A DPO is basically an expert who makes sure companies are handling all this personal data the right way, legally.
Exactly. And they have to navigate this whole maze of data protection laws, which for Spain, that means both the GDPR and their own national law, the LOPDGDD.
Okay, so Spain has this two-layered system, which makes the DPO role even more important, it seems. So now I'm wondering, when does a company in Spain actually need to have a DPO? Is it every single business or what?
Well, the GDPR, that's the one for the whole EU. They say you have to have a BPO in 3 main cases. 1, if you're a public body. 2, if you're doing a lot of systematic monitoring of people. And 3, if you're processing sensitive data, like health info, on a large scale. Think of like those big social media companies, analyzing how people are using their platforms, or hospitals dealing with tons of patient data.
Makes sense. Those are some pretty clear examples. But it looks like Spain goes even further with their LODGD thing. This website from the law firm lists all these specific organizations that need a DPO. It's a long list. Schools, like every kind of school, public, private, doesn't matter. Then there's telecom companies, banks, and other financial places, insurance companies, energy companies, and even, get this, credit reporting agencies.
It definitely covers a lot more than the GDPR. And I think putting things like schools on that list shows just how much Spain cares about protecting children's data. Think about it. Schools have so much sensitive information. Academic records, behavior stuff, maybe even health records. It makes sense that Spain wants a dedicated expert keeping an eye on all of that.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about how much data, but also what kind of data. But I'm also seeing here on the website that not every single place in Spain needs a DPO. They mention small businesses and individual healthcare practitioners as examples.
Right, they're saying it all depends on how much data you're processing and what kind of data it is. So a small business that's not dealing with tons of personal data, they might not be required to have a DPO. Same goes for a doctor working on their own.
So even if a DPO isn't mandatory everywhere, it sounds like everybody still needs to be careful about data protection.
Oh, absolutely. Complying with data protection laws, that's a must no matter what. If you handle personal data, even a small business or a doctor, you got to have the right safeguards in place.
Okay, so now I'm curious about what a DPO actually does day to day. I mean, that sounds like a pretty big responsibility.
It is, for sure. You can think of them as the data protection champion for their organization. They wear a lot of hats. According to this website, DPOs have to advise on anything and everything related to data protection, making sure they're following both the GDPR and the LOPDGDD. Plus, they have to monitor compliance, do internal audits, and act as a point of contact for, everyone involved, the people whose data is being processed, and the Spanish Data Protection Agency.
So it's not just about sitting in a corner reading legal documents all day.
Oh, not at all. They're really involved in shaping how the organization handles data protection. That could mean drafting privacy policies, doing those data protection impact assessments, or even training staff on how to handle data responsibly. And if there's a data breach, they're the ones leading the response and letting everyone know.
Wow, sounds pretty demanding. What kind of background do you even need to be a DPO?
Well, the source doesn't really get into specific qualifications, but it's pretty obvious you need a deep understanding of data protection law and best practices, of course. They have to be fluent in the GDPR, obviously, but also all the ins and outs of Spanish data protection law, especially the LOPDGDD. Strong analytical skills are important, too, that attention to detail. And let's not forget communication skills. They need to be able to explain these complicated legal things to both tech people and non-tech people.
It's almost like they need to be translators, bridging the gap between the legal stuff and the practical stuff of handling data.
Yeah, exactly. They take those legal requirements and turn them into actual steps and procedures that the organization can follow.
So let's say a company in Spain realizes, we need a DPO. What are their options? Do they have to hire someone new just for that?
There's some flexibility there. They could pick someone internally if they have an employee who already knows all this stuff, or they could bring in an outside consultant.
So no one right way to do it.
Exactly. The key is to have someone who can handle the DPO responsibilities and work independently, whether they're an employee or a consultant.
So this has been super informative, but let's connect this back to everyone listening who might not be in Spain. Why should they care about all this DPO stuff and these specific Spanish regulations?
That's the real value of what we're doing here today. Even if you don't do business in Spain, this gives you a glimpse into how data protection is changing globally. First off, it shows how data protection is becoming more localized. Countries are adding their own interpretations and requirements on top of the GDPR, so businesses that work internationally really need to keep up.
It's like a data privacy puzzle with pieces from all over the world.
Haha, exactly. And second, the way Spain's approaching it, especially with sectors like education, shows that data protection is becoming more important in certain industries. Even if your business isn't directly affected by this LOPDGDD, you might see similar things happening where you are.
So by looking at how other countries are handling this, we can kind of predict the future of data privacy regulations, right?
Absolutely. It's like a crystal ball for data privacy. And this brings up another important point from the source, which is that data protection is an ongoing thing. It's not a one-time fix.
It's not like checking a box and you're done.
Right. They emphasize that organizations need to keep adapting how they protect data. Technology keeps changing, and regulations are always evolving, so you can't just set it and forget it.
So it's more like a cycle, right? Assessing, implementing, monitoring, and improving.
Exactly. And that's why the DPO is so important. They make sure the organization stays on top of things and keeps following the rules.
Okay, so we've covered the who, the what, and the why of DPOs in Spain. But what does all of this mean, big picture, for businesses and individuals?
The million-dollar question, right? I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in how we think about data and privacy. It's not something we can ignore anymore. It's front and center for everyone, businesses and individuals.
Yeah, it feels like data privacy has gone from the fine print to the headlines.
Totally. And that has huge consequences. For businesses, it means they can't just think about data protection as an afterthought. It has to be baked into everything they do, from developing products to marketing. For individuals, it means being more aware of their rights when it comes to data and taking control of their digital footprint.
Makes me wonder about all this new technology coming out. Like, what happens when AI starts collecting and processing even more data than ever before?
Oh, that's an interesting point. And that definitely brings up a whole bunch of new questions and challenges.
It's like we're entering uncharted territory, and the rules are still being written, especially when it comes to AI and data.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to be having these conversations right now. We need to think ahead about the challenges and the opportunities that are coming in this fast-changing world.
You know what else strikes me? This whole focus on data protection is changing the legal profession itself. This Spanish law firm we're talking about, MCHMAbogados, they have a whole section of their website dedicated to data protection services.
That's a really good observation. As these data privacy regulations get more complex and more countries adopt them, the need for legal experts in this area is just skyrocketing.
So it's like a whole new legal frontier opening up.
Absolutely. We're seeing a huge demand for data protection lawyers, consultants, privacy professionals, you name it. It's becoming a real specialty.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like data protection is creating its own little world, you know?
It is. And it's not just lawyers either. It's affecting tech people, policymakers, even teachers. We all have to think about data in a completely new way.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into data protection in Spain, what are the main things you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
For me, the most important thing is that data protection isn't some niche issue anymore. It's a fundamental part of doing business and just living in our digital world.
It's almost like you need to be data literate, just like you need to be financially literate these days.
Exactly. We all need to know our rights and responsibilities when it comes to data. That means staying informed, keeping up with the latest regulations, and making smart choices about how we handle our own data and how we interact with businesses online.
So a lot of this comes down to just being aware and making informed choices.
Definitely. It's an ongoing thing, and we all have a part to play in shaping the future of data privacy.
So to leave our listeners with something to think about, how do you see this focus on data protection changing the relationship between businesses and consumers in the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? Will it create more transparency and trust? Will it encourage businesses to be more ethical with data? Or will it lead to even more challenges and complications? It's a conversation that's just starting. Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
For sure. So we've talked about who needs a DPO in Spain, but what I really want to know is what do they actually do every day? It seems like a pretty big job.
Oh, it definitely is. Think of them as like the data protection quarterback for the company. They got to be on top of everything. Our source says they advise on all things data protection, making sure the organization is following both the GDPR and the LOPDGDD. Plus, they're responsible for monitoring compliance, doing internal audits, and being the point of contact for data subjects, the people whose data is actually being processed. And they're the contact for the Spanish Data Protection Agency, too.
So it's not just reading legal documents all day long.
No way. They're very hands-on. DPOs are involved in creating the data protection practices for the whole organization. They might write privacy policies, do those data protection impact assessments, or train staff on how to handle data responsibly. And if there's a data breach, they're the ones leading the response and making sure everyone gets notified.
Wow, that's a lot. So what kind of background does someone need to be a DPO?
Well, the source doesn't give specific qualifications, but you can tell they need to know data protection law like the back of their hand. Plus best practices, of course. They got to be fluent in the GDPR, obviously, but also all the little details of Spanish data protection law, especially that LOPDGDD. Strong analytical skills are important, too, being detail-oriented. And communication is huge, too. They got to be able to explain these complex legal concepts to both tech people and non-tech people.
So like a translator almost, bridging the legal side and the practical side of working with data.
Exactly. They take those legal requirements and turn them into steps and procedures that the organization can actually use.
Okay, so let's say a company in Spain realizes, uh-oh, we need a DPO. What can they do? Do they have to hire someone new just for this?
They have a few options. They can appoint someone internally, like if they already have an employee who knows their stuff, or they can bring in an outside DPO consultant.
But there's not one right way to do it.
Nope. The main thing is to have someone who can actually do the job and work independently. Doesn't matter if they're an employee or a consultant.
So this has been super helpful, but let's bring it back to all our listeners who might not work in Spain. Why should they care about this DPO stuff and these specific Spanish regulations?
That's what makes this deep dive so valuable. Even if you're not in Spain, this shows you how data protection is changing worldwide. First, it shows that data protection is becoming more localized. Countries are adding their own interpretations and requirements on top of the GDPR, so if you're a business working internationally, you really need to keep up.
Like a data privacy puzzle with pieces from everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And second, what Spain is doing, especially with things like education, shows that data protection is becoming more important in certain industries. Even if your business isn't directly affected by this Appoint law, you might see similar trends where you are.
So paying attention to how other countries are doing this, it's like we can see the future of data privacy regulations.
Exactly. It's like a crystal ball for data privacy. And this brings up something else important that our source mentions. Data protection isn't a one-time thing. You can't just check it off your list.
It's not like you do it once and you're good.
Right. The source says organizations have to constantly adapt how they protect data. Technology is always changing. Regulations are always evolving. You can't just set it and forget it.
So it's more like a cycle, right? Assessing, implementing, monitoring, and improving.
Exactly. And the DPO is key to that whole cycle. They make sure the organization stays ahead of the curve and follows the rules.
Okay, so we've talked about who DPOs are, what they do, and why they matter. But what I'm really thinking about now is the bigger picture. What does all this mean for businesses and people in general?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think we're seeing a really big change in how we think about data and privacy. It's not something we can just push aside anymore. It's right there in everyone's face, businesses and individuals alike.
Yeah, it feels like data privacy has gone from the fine print to the front page.
Exactly. And that comes with a lot of consequences. For businesses, it means they can't treat data protection as an afterthought. They have to build it into everything they do, from how they develop products to how they do marketing. For individuals, it means knowing their rights when it comes to data and taking control of their digital footprint.
It makes you wonder about all this new technology that's coming out. What happens when AI starts collecting and processing more data than we've ever seen before?
That's a fascinating point. That raises a whole new set of questions and challenges.
It's like we're in this brand new world and no one's quite sure what the rules are yet, especially when it comes to AI and data.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's why these conversations are so important now. We got to figure out what's coming, the good and the bad, in this crazy, fast-changing world.
Speaking of good things, this whole data protection thing seems like it's creating some pretty big opportunities for the legal world. Like this Spanish law firm we're talking about, MCHMAbogados, they have a whole part of their website just for data protection services.
You're right. That's a really interesting point. As data privacy rules get more complicated and more countries start using them, the need for legal experts is going to explode.
So it's like a whole new area of law is opening up, with specialists who know all the ins and outs of data protection.
Exactly. We're seeing a huge demand for data protection lawyers, consultants, privacy pros, you name it. It's becoming a real specialty.
Wow, that's pretty wild. It's like data protection is creating its own little universe,
It really is. And it's not just lawyers either. It's changing things for tech people, policymakers, even teachers. We're all having to think about data in a way we never did before.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into data protection in Spain, what are the big takeaways? What do you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that data protection isn't just some side issue anymore. It's a core part of doing business and living in this digital world.
Yeah, it's like being data literate is as important as being financially literate these days.
Exactly. We all need to understand our rights and what we're responsible for when it comes to data. So we need to stay informed, keep up with all the new regulations, and make good choices about how we handle our own data and how we interact with businesses online.
So a lot of it comes down to just being aware and making informed choices.
Absolutely. And it's something we have to keep working on. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of data privacy.
So to leave our listeners with something to ponder, how do you see this focus on data protection changing how businesses and consumers interact in the future?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Will it lead to more transparency and trust? Will it push businesses to be more ethical with data? Or will we run into even more challenges and roadblocks we haven't even thought of yet? These are things we all need to be asking ourselves, whether we're consumers or business owners. And it's a conversation that's just getting started. That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.